بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وأصلح لنا شأننا كله ولا تكلنا إلى أنفسنا طرفة عين. Inshallah, we're going to be continuing with our Muslim Essentials program. And the first of the two books that we're going to be going through, as we usually do, is the book Important Lessons for Every Muslim. And so far we are in lesson number 6. So lesson number 1, we covered the tafsir of Surah Al-Fatiha along with the tafsir from Surah Al-Zalzala all the way to Surah Al-Nas. Lesson number 2, we covered the 5 pillars of Islam. Lesson number 3, we covered the 6 pillars of Iman. Lesson number 4, we covered the meaning of Tawheed and the meaning of Shirk. Lesson number 5, we spoke about the definition of Ihsan and what the reality of Ihsan is. Lesson number 6, inshallah, now the author is going to be talking about Salah. Now we're going to be getting into Salah, and this lesson specifically will be talking about Shurutul Salah, which means what are the preconditions for prayer? What is required before you can establish the prayer itself. Okay? قال المؤلف رحمه الله, the author, he says that the 6th lesson is about the conditions of prayer. And he's going to mention 9 of them. He's going to mention 9 conditions of prayer, and we'll go through each of them today one by one. So he says, شروط الصلاة وهي 9. The conditions of prayer are 9. Al-Islam, that the person has to be Muslim. Wal-aqlu, that the person has to have sound intellect, and we'll speak about what each one means. Wat-tamyiz, which means discernment. The person has an ability to discern and differentiate right from wrong, good from bad, and we'll describe what the definition of each one is. Wa-raf'ul hadathi, and the removal of hadath. We'll talk about that briefly and shortly when we get there. Wa-izalatun najasa, and removing or the lifting of impurities. وَسِتْرُ الْعَوْرَةِ, and the covering of one's private area. What is the awrah? What is the awrah for salah specifically? We'll speak about that inshallah. وَدُخُولُ الْوَقْتِ, and entering the time. Jazakallah khair. وَدُخُولُ الْوَقْتِ, the entrance of the prayer time is a condition for the prayer. وَاسْتِقْبَالُ الْقِبْلَةِ, and to face the direction of the qibla. وَالنِّيَّةِ, and the intention. So, first off, this pillar of Islam, which we spoke about in lesson number 2, the prayer, is the most important physical act of worship that we as Muslims do. And it is the most important thing after the foundation of faith, right? Which is testifying that Allah alone is worthy of worship and that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. And it is the first thing that we will be asked about on the Day of Judgment. As the Prophet ﷺ told us, that the first thing that will be asked about is the prayer. And if the prayer is upright, then everything else will be okay. And if it is not upright, then everything else will be a state of failure for the person. Okay? So the Prophet ﷺ said the first thing will be asked about pertaining to the acts of worship is prayer. And the first thing that will be asked about on the Day of Judgment pertaining to the rights of the people will be with regards to blood and the taking of lives. Okay? So the point is, this is an important act of worship. And because it is important and because it is obligatory, right? Then it is also obligatory for us to know how to pray and know everything that is connected to the prayer. So if an act is obligatory, then the knowledge of it is also obligatory. You're not excused, you don't have the excuse to be ignorant about an act of worship that is obligatory in the religion. You can't, there's no excuse for it. Some things are obligatory at an individual level because you have to perform it. The prayer is obligatory. And any other act of worship that becomes obligatory for you to do, then you need to know it. So for example, when Ramadan comes in, you need to know everything pertaining to Ramadan. When you qualify to perform Hajj, you need to know how to perform Hajj. When you qualify to pay Zakah, you got to know how to pay Zakah. Right? When anything connected to the transactions and interactions between people, buying and selling, Once you start a business, right? Once you start a company, you're an entrepreneur selling things online, you have to know what are the rules pertaining to buying and selling. You can't just simply go into it blind and then get into the business and then later start asking, well, I did this and I bought this and I traded in this and can I do this and can I do that? You should have, in the first place, began by knowing what you're getting yourself into, right? If you're getting married, you got to know what you're doing. You have to take the time to learn. What is your responsibility towards your wife? What is her responsibility towards her husband? You can't walk into it blindly, right? And this is the way the religion, Al-Islam, teaches us that we are not supposed to be ignorant about whatever it is that is obliged upon us at that moment, okay? So the knowledge, the learning about how to pray is obligatory. Just the way we mentioned earlier in the previous lessons, that learning about your faith, knowing who Allah is, knowing about your Prophet, knowing about the tenets of your faith, you gotta know it. Ignorance is not an excuse if it is obligatory for you to understand it, okay? So, Salah is the most important act of worship, and it is the first of the obligations in the religion of Al-Islam. So, now we're going to get into talking about the preconditions. One of the things that are also important to do pertaining to prayer or learning about prayer is speaking about the virtues of prayer, glorifying the prayer, mentioning the importance of the Salah. And that is important to encourage people, to motivate them to pray, right? We're not going to be doing that now, but inshallah we'll be making sessions in the near future specifically with regards to the importance of the prayer, right? What is known as ta'zeem salah, to magnify and glorify this important act of worship, okay? We'll leave that for another time, but now we're going to be talking about today the preconditions of the prayer. And in the Sharia or in Islam, the word condition or shart is a singular term for condition, and the plural is shurut. And they say the meaning of, according to the scholars, the meaning of a condition is هو ما يلزم من عدمه العدم ولا يلزم من وجوده وجود ولا عدم لذاته. Which means that a condition is something that it necessitates, its absence does not need anything, but its presence necessitates it. So if something is present and there's a condition for it, the condition also has to be there. So for example, to make the example clear, wudu is a condition for salah. You have to have wudu to pray. So the time of the prayer coming in necessitates wudu to also be present and obligated. But if it's not time for prayer, then you don't need to make wudu. Does that make sense? So if there is no time for salah at that moment, then it's not obligatory for you to make wudu. But if the time for prayer comes in, then it becomes obligatory for you to make wudu, right? On its own, the wudu itself becomes obligatory because of the prayer. And once we talk about each condition, it's going to make sense what these conditions are. So the author mentioned that condition number one for salah or shart, the first precondition is al-Islam, right? Meaning you have to be a Muslim for prayer to be obligatory upon you, for that prayer to be accepted. If somebody who's a non-Muslim prays salah, that prayer is not accepted. The prayer is not accepted from them, right? So Islam is the first condition of prayer, and it's also the condition for every act of worship. Any act of worship, whether it's salah, fasting, hajj, you have to be a Muslim first before performing these acts of worship. It is not accepted from you if you are not a Muslim. Although, and some of the scholars talk about this in the tafsir of the Quran, although the Quran indicates that those who are not Muslim, will be asked about the salah. Although they're not Muslim, but on the Day of Judgment, from the reasons that they're going to be thrown into the hellfire, they will respond by saying, we were not amongst those who pray. مَا سَلَكَكُمْ فِي سَقَرٍ قَالُوا لَمْ نَكُ مِنَ الْمُصَلِّينَ وَلَمْ نَكُ نُطْعِمُ الْمِسْكِينَ وَكُنَّا نَخُوضُ مَعَ الْخَائِضِينَ وَكُنَّا نُكَذِّبُ بِيَوْمِ الدِّينِ حَتَّى أَتَانَا الْيَقِينَ. Allah is speaking about those people who were the rejectors of the belief in the afterlife. These are the disbelievers. Why were you thrown into the blazing fire of hell? They will respond by saying, we didn't pray, we didn't feed the poor people, we used to engage with those who are evil, we used to deny and reject the concept of the afterlife, but now the reality and the certainty has come to us and we can see that the afterlife is real. So what's understood from those ayat is, it is also obligated upon them, but what is obviously before that is they have to submit and believe. If they don't believe, then any act that they perform, whether they fast or whether they pray, or it's not accepted unless they come forth with believing that Allah alone is deserving to be worshipped and that Muhammad ﷺ is the last and final messenger. So al-Islam is the first condition. Number 2 is al-aqlu, sanity. Sanity. The opposite of al-aql is junoon. Junoon is insanity, right? So the person has to be somebody who is intellectually sound and is not insane. Because the person who is insane, their pen has been lifted for them. As the Prophet ﷺ mentioned in the hadith narrated by Ali ibn Abi Talib, he said, alayhi salatu wasalam, rufi' al-qalamu an thalath. That the pen has been lifted for 3 individuals, right? Number 1 is an-na'imu hatta yastayqidh, the one who's sleeping until he wakes up, right? وَالْمَجْنُونَ حَتَّى يَعْقُلْ, or hatta, until he becomes the insane person, until they regain their mental faculties. Okay? And the third person is the one who passes out. The one who passes out, who faints, or the one who's put to sleep, whether it's because of a surgery or they're put through anesthetics, until they wake up from that. طيب? So the person who is majnoon, right, is considered to be somebody who is not held to account up until they regain their mental faculties. Then they're held to account. So al-aqlu is a condition for salah. Number 3 is at-tamyiz. Tamyiz can be known as the age of discernment. And this, with salah specifically, it's referring to when the child reaches the age of 7. When the child becomes 7 years old, then we have to tell them to pray. They have to pray at the age of 7. As the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, command your children to pray at the age of 7. Muru abna'akum bis-salati li sab'i sinin. Command them to pray at 7. Right? Start training them and teaching them before they're 7, so that when they reach that age, they know it's part of the regular routine. Right? It's not smart to simply ignore them and then all of a sudden when they reach the age, force it upon them and they're not going to understand. But they will most likely listen at that age. They're still young, they'll listen, but it's easier to begin training them and making it a routine for them beforehand. And of course, seeing it from you will make it a lot easier because children naturally copycat and imitate their parents. So command them to pray at 7. And the Prophet ﷺ said, at the age of 10, discipline them. Now it's obligatory for them to pray. They have to pray at the age of 10. وَفَرِّقُوهُنَّ فِي الْمَضَاجِعِ. And also at the age of 10, you don't let the boys and the girls in the house sleep in the same bed. You separate them. You don't let them sleep in the same bed at that age. The point is, tamyiz. So at the age of 7, you start telling them to pray. If they're still not praying at 10, then you have to discipline them and make sure that they pray. Right? And more importantly, along with that is, like I said at the beginning, teaching them the importance, the value, right? Giving them acknowledgement for performing it. Obviously, you want to teach them that they're doing this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You don't want them to learn that they're doing it for your sake, to get some type of praise from you or some accolades from you, rewarding them for it. So you need to encourage them, but instill within them that this is something that they're doing for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's the third condition, at-tamyiz. Number 4 is raf'ul hadath, the lifting off of al-hadath. And al-hadath is known as, it can be best translated as spiritual impurity. Meaning, there's 2 types of hadath, the major and the minor hadath. The minor hadath is what necessitates you to make wudu. Anything that necessitates you to make wudu is known as al-hadath al-asghar. So whether it's using the bathroom, akramakumullah, whatever it is that breaks your wudu, that is known as al-hadathul asghar. And al-hadathul akbar is what necessitates you to perform ghusl. And we'll be speaking about wudu and ghusl in the upcoming chapters, inshallah ta'ala. Okay? So, if you are in a state that necessitates you to perform wudu or ghusl, you cannot pray until you lift off the hadith. So how is the minor hadith lifted? By making wudu. And how is the major hadith lifted? By performing ghusl. Alright? Ghusl is a complete bath. While wudu is what we do before we pray, washing your hands, washing your face, as Allah in the Quran says, your two hands, wiping over your head, and washing your feet. And we'll speak about that when we get there, insha'Allah ta'ala. If a person prays while they're in a state of hadith, whether it's major or minor, then that salah is not accepted. لا تقبل صلاة بغير طهور. As the Prophet ﷺ said, a salah without being in a state of purification is not accepted. Okay? That's number 4. Number 5 is izalatun najasa, the removal of the impurity. So the removal of the impurity can be the impurity that is either on your clothes, on your body, or on the place that you're praying. So the area that you're praying has to be one that is clean, and there should also be no impurities on your body and on your clothing. Okay? So that is if there is something that is there from the impurities, then that is going to be preventing the salah from being accepted or correct unless it is removed. Na'am. So like I said, those three, the impurities have to be cleaned from body and your clothes and the place where you're praying. Number 6 is sitrul awra, the covering of the awra. What is obligated for you to cover for the prayer? The awra for the man with regards to the prayer is from the navel to the knees and the shoulders. So you have to cover your shoulders as well as from the belly button to your knees. That's for the salah. Outside of the salah, the shoulders are not considered to be awra, but the awra is ma bayna surra ila rukba, from the navel to the knees. Okay. And for the woman, her awra is her entire body with the exception of her face and her 2 hands. Her entire body with the exception of her face and her 2 hands. That is condition number 5, sitrul awra. And this is an important point actually to focus on, this issue of sitrul awra, because this is something unfortunately that has been neglected in the times that we're living in, both on the side of men and women. Right? And I've received several complaints here in the masjid with regards to this issue of sitrul awra, especially in salah, from sisters and from brothers. Right? So brothers, you have to make sure you understand, from your belly button to your knee is the awra. Therefore, if your pants are too tight or your t-shirt is too short, where when you're making a ruku' and sujood, your lower back is showing, or your belly is going to show, or your sides are going to show, that is under your navel. And that's going to cause your salah to be invalid. Right? These are things that are not taken into consideration. Or sometimes the extraordinarily tight clothing that is worn by both men and women. But it's surprising to see men also come into the masjid and this is their reality. Right? So you need to make sure that you cover. Right? In the summertime, you had the phenomenon of people coming in with shorts. Okay, it's understandable. Maybe they're going to be outside, maybe they're playing sports, right? First of all, try to wear shorts that are at least covering your knees, right? And if you're going to come to the masjid with those shorts, then have a plan that maybe you're going to have, a thobe or a ma'awis or something, or an izar in your car, so you can cover up when you come to the masjid to pray, or wherever it is you're praying. If salah catches you wherever you are, to make sure that you're covered up. Because from the preconditions in preparation for prayer is that you need to be properly covered for both the men and the woman. Sitrul awra. Number 6, dukhulul waqt. The time of the salah has to come in. Meaning, you can't pray before the time of prayer. You have to make sure the time of the prayer comes in. And now it's easy because you have applications on your phone, on your watch. You can have, you know what the time of each of the prayers are. They even have apps that even tell you what time each masjid in the city, their adhan time is, their iqamah time is. So now there's no excuse to pray before time because you know. And if you don't have a clock and you don't have, an application or anything or a calendar for that point, then you're going to have to do it old school and, observe the sun, right? And the Prophet ﷺ, when he was teaching the companions pertaining to the times of the prayer, that's what he did, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? He, one day, alayhi salatu wasalam, prayed at the entrance of each of the prayer times. Each of the prayer times, Fajr, Dhuhr, the whole day. And then the next day, he prayed towards the end of the times of those prayer times, and then he made it clear to the companions that that time in between is the time period for each prayer. But we have been encouraged and commanded to pray salah at its prescribed time, its earliest time. Inna salata kanat ala al-mu'minina kitaban mawquta. Allah says that indeed the prayer upon that has been prescribed upon the believer has been prescribed at its specific appointed times. All right? So that is with regards to the salah. So with regards to the Fajr is prayed like the Prophet ﷺ mentioned after in the night time there is in the early morning before the dawn breaks, there is a small little lighting that happens. It's very dim and then it gets dark again, and that's leading up to before the day breaks. So that time before the day breaks is when the time of Fajr is prayed. And the time ends for Fajr when the sun is fully up, right? So that's the Fajr time. As for Salatul Dhuhr, the Salatul Dhuhr is prayed after the sun moves from the middle, right? When the sun moves from the middle, that's when Dhuhr comes in. So noon is when the sun is literally on top. So slightly after the sun moves is when the time for Dhuhr comes in. And the time Dhuhr goes from that time, and it ends when they used to measure the time by shadows. So if you put an object and you see a slight shadow, that means it's a time of Dhuhr that came in because the sun has moved from the shadow. So it's going to result in a slight shadow. If you put an arrow or a spear, then you can see, or even the human being, if you're standing there, you can see its slight shadow. When it reaches where the shadow is equal in length to the object, that's the end of Dhuhr, right? And that is the time for Asr. And the time of Asr continues up until there is two shadows. And the shadow is double the length of the body. That means it's coming towards closer to Maghrib time. All right? Maghrib is from when the sun begins to set up until it gets dark. And after it gets dark is when the time of Isha comes in. طيب. That is in summary with regards to the entrance of the time. The 8th condition is facing the Qibla. And the Qibla is referring to the Kaaba in Mecca. So facing the direction of the Qibla is from the conditions of the Salah. Allah in the Quran says, فَوَلِّ وَجْهَكَ شَطْرَ الْمَسْجِدِ الْحَرَامِ. So face towards the direction of the sacred masjid, which is in Mecca. And the Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith to the man who came in and prayed incorrectly. Or there's a famous hadith where the Prophet ﷺ was sitting with his companions. A man came into the masjid and he prayed salah, and when he finished praying, he came to the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ told him, go back and pray because you didn't pray. He prayed a second time, came back, go back and pray because you didn't pray. He came back a third time and he told him, go back because you didn't pray. And then the Prophet ﷺ explained to him after the man asked, this is all I know. This is the limit to what I know pertaining to prayer. So the Prophet began explaining to him step by step how to pray. And at the beginning he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, إِذَا قُمْتَ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ فَأَصْبِغِ الْوُضُوءِ ثُمَّ اسْتَقْبِلِ الْقِبْلَةِ. When you begin the prayer, when the time for prayer comes in and you stand up for prayer, first and foremost, perform wudu. And make sure you perform wudu until you reach all the parts where you have to perform it completely. And then face the direction of the Qibla. And then the hadith is long, it continues. But my point is, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned there to face the Qibla. And an important point to understand pertaining to the Qibla is, you face the direction of the Qibla. right? If you're far away from the Qibla, or if the Qibla is not within your sight, you can't see the actual Kaaba itself, then you're not obligated to face the exact direction of the Qibla of the Kaaba itself. Rather, you face the overall direction of where the Kaaba is. You have some people, and I've seen this before here in the city, where they come to you and say, well, all these mosques don't pray in the right direction. Because if you calculate, and they go on Google Maps or Google Earth, if you calculate the distance from where we are in Ottawa all the way to the Kaaba, that means we have to face southwest or that's not what we're obligated to do. We're obligated to face the direction of the Qibla. When the Messenger of Allah ﷺ was in Mecca, he used to face the direction of Baytul Maqdis facing the Kaaba. So when he was in Mecca, before he moved, he would pray by the Kaaba facing the Qibla, but towards the direction of north, because Sham and where Jerusalem is north. Then when he went to Medina, alayhi salatu wasalam, for about 16 and a half or 17 months, he was facing north, towards Baytul Maqdis, until Allah commanded this ayah we mentioned earlier, turn towards Masjid al-Haram. Then now they turn, and now they face in Medina, they face south. Because Mecca is south of Medina. So they face south. So if you're north of wherever you are in the world, if you're north, then you face south, right? If you, depending on the direction. If you're south, you face north. If you're east, وهكذا. So in this part of the world, we face the direction of east. Okay, does that make sense? But if you see the Kaaba, and the Kaaba is physically in front of you, then you have to face the Kaaba itself. You have to face the Kaaba itself, which is why, for those of you who've been to Umrah or Hajj, you see those who are praying in the Sahan or the main floor of the Kaaba, then they have to face the Kaaba itself. But there are people who are praying in the masjid in Mecca who can't see the Kaaba. If you're inside or on the second or third floor, right, then you face the overall direction. And at least there they have the marble designed where it shows you exactly what way you're facing. Right? The lines and the marble is kind of aligned to face the direction. طيب. And the last condition of prayer is the niyyah. Niyyah, which is the intention. You have to make the intention for the prayer. Right? What are you doing? What's the intention that you're doing? You pray, you're praying dhuhr, you're praying asr. You have to make the niyyah of what you're praying. And the niyyah is not something that is difficult, by the way. The niyyah is something, the fact that you have already committed to performing this act of worship is you making the intention. Right? I'm going to the masjid, I'm making wudu, I walk in, it's Maghrib time, I'm praying Maghrib. All of that commitment to that act is the intention that you're making. Right? And the reason why this is important to illustrate or mention is because you have a lot of people, or some people, who have a difficulty with the issue of the niyyah. Where they will say, you know, I'm not sure, did I make my intention or not? What should I do? And then they have some, you see, it builds up this this issue of, you know, borderline paranoia at times, right? Or they're hesitant. I'm not sure. I didn't enter into my prayer. So the person will repeat the prayer again because I didn't make an intention. Oh, I'm not sure if I made wudu. So the intention is not a difficult thing. You simply make it in your heart by committing to the fact that you are about to pray. Or whatever other act of worship that you're doing that requires intention, right? And all acts of worship require you to have the intention. And the intention is what makes a distinction between this being an act of worship and this it being some regular act that you're doing, right? If you're making a ghusl, what makes a difference between this being a ghusl, which is intended to remove off the major hadith, versus it is a regular shower that you're taking to cool off? The distinction is the niyyah. The intention makes the difference between this being an ibadah versus this being, you know, a regular act that you're doing to cool off. All right? So, and the obligation of the niyyah in our acts of worship is based on the famous hadith that we all know, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا نَوَى. Indeed, every action is based and predicated upon making its intention. And every person will get based on what they intended. Right? And this is a general rule pertaining to all acts of worship. So those are the 9 conditions of the salah. Inshallah, in our next lesson, we're going to get to talking about what are the pillars of the prayer. So what is the easiest way for you to make a distinction between these terms, conditions of prayer, pillars of prayer. The condition that we spoke about all happened prior to you beginning the prayer. What we spoke about, these 9 things, you haven't started the prayer yet. You're talking about the preconditions, what you need to do in preparation for the act of worship. Now, when we get to the pillars of prayer and the obligatory acts of prayer and the sunnah acts of prayer, you're going to come to see that all of it is related to what we do within the prayer itself, right? Within the act itself, okay? And we'll speak about the pillars of the prayer, inshallah ta'ala, in our class next Wednesday. That is pertaining to our first part of the Wednesday lesson or the Muslim Essentials lesson. The second part is going through, as we have been doing, the book which is famously known as the 40 Hadith of Al-Imam An-Nawawi, rahimahullahu ta'ala. And today we reached Hadith number 17. We reached Hadith number 17, okay? So last week we covered and we finished Hadith number 16. And we mentioned all of these ahadith in this collection of Al-Imam An-Nawawi has important principles that are foundational in the religion of Islam that we have to pay attention to. That's why the actual name of the book, right? Although it's famously known as Al-Arba'un Al-Nawawiyya or the 40 of Imam Nawawi, but the actual title that the author wrote for it was Al-Arba'un fi Mabani al-Islam wa Qawa'id al-Ahkam. It is the 40 pertaining to the foundations or the pillars of Islam and the principles and the ahkam and the rules of the religion. So you'll always see either principles that are derived from all of these ahadith. Let's get to hadith number 17 now. And this hadith is the hadith in Sahih Muslim, which was narrated by the companion Shaddad ibn Aus. Okay, al-hadith al-sabi' ashar. عن أبي يعلى شداد بن أوس رضي الله عنه عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن الله كتب الإحسان على كل شيء فإذا قتلتم فأحسنوا القتلة وإذا ذبحتم فأحسنوا الذبحة وليحد أحدكم شفرته وليرح ذبيحته رواه مسلم. So this hadith is collected in the collection of Imam Muslim. And here the Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم is speaking about the principle with regards to perfection in all of our actions. Aiming for perfection in all of our actions. This is similar to what we spoke about when we spoke about al-ihsan, right? This is an example with regards to ihsan, okay? So the Prophet ﷺ here is saying, إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَتَبَ الْإِحْسَانَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ. That Allah has prescribed excellence or aiming for perfection in all of our affairs, in everything. So he brought some examples pertaining to some acts that need to be done properly. He mentioned, number 1, فَإِذَا قَتَلْتُمْ فَأَحْسِنُوا الْقِتْلَةِ. If you are to kill, then do it properly. What is killing here referring to? This is referring specifically to anything connected to corporal punishments. We mentioned that a couple of hadiths ago. Remember the hadith when we spoke about لا يحل دم امرئ مسلم إلا بإحدى ثلاث, right? The only times that the general rule in Islam is the blood of the Muslim is haram. Let me ask you guys a question for those of you who were here last time. We mentioned last time the blood in Islam, blood is haram for 2 reasons. What were they? Anybody remember? Okay, if you're a Muslim, so Iman. And what is the second one? Okay, but what does that come under? Mumtaz. They're protected by the Sharia, so Aman. So there's 2 things that make the blood haram. Number 1 is Iman, that's for the believer. The believer's blood is haram. You cannot spill the blood of a Muslim. Does that mean now that the blood of the non-Muslim is also halal? No, because the Sharia legislates that Aman is also a protection for a person's blood. And what comes under Aman is a whole list of categories. If there's a contract between the Muslims and the non-Muslims, if they're living under the authority of the Muslims, there's a list of things that Sharia mentions that the blood of the non-Muslim becomes haram in all of those conditions. So Aman, safety, there are many situations where the blood of the non-Muslim is also protected by law in Islam, right? And there are specific warnings against those who transgress that, right? For example, the mu'ahid is the person who you're in a contract, you're in a contract with, you're in a peace treaty with, or there is a relationship between the two nations where the person that they can come into the country and there's an agreement that they can come in and engage in buying and selling in business, then the spilling of the blood is haram. And if they are killed, then the one who killed will never enter paradise, as the Prophet ﷺ said. So Islam is very strict with regards to the issue of blood being spilled. And the legislation mentions that clear cut. Okay? So, here the killing that is being mentioned here is not with regards to anything except for the corporal punishment that is established by the authority. Remember when we spoke about capital punishments in Islam? We mentioned that Islam is not a vigilante religion. We don't take the law into our own hands. Rather, it has to be done based on a system of governance that is the one that is in charge of that. The judge, and the judge is only doing so within the authority of a government that is practicing the law. Right? So there's no honor killings in Islam. You don't, execute somebody in your basement. That's not from Islam. None of that exists. And anybody that claims that is Islam, then they're lying about their religion. طيب? So, but in the ones who are responsible for doing the hudud and the corporal punishments, they have to make sure they're doing it properly. That they're not doing any harm to the person. They're not doing any excessive harm beyond what is required for that particular punishment. So the Prophet is saying, do it with ihsan. Second example he brought, alayhi salatu wasalam, was with regards to the slaughtering of the animals. The animals that are to be sacrificed, right? The animals that we consume, or the sacrifices that are made for the different acts of worship, whether it's a udhiyah, a qurbani, an aqiqah, whatever it is. Any type of slaughtering that is done, it has to be done with perfection. And the Prophet specifically mentioned, وَلْيُحِدَّ أَحَدُكُمْ شَفْرَتَهُ. Let the person sharpen the tool that they're using to slaughter the animal. وَلْيُرِحْ ذَبِيحَتَهُ, so that it can be easy for the animal that is being slaughtered. So the Prophet ﷺ here is specifically mentioning pertaining to the animal that is being dealt with, right? And Islam is very, very strict with regards to the dealing with animals, let alone the human beings. The animals and how the animals are treated and dealt with in Islam, we see from the Messenger of Allah's practice that they were very, very strict with regards to how to deal with animals. So for example, that the Prophet ﷺ would not allow the branding of animals. Branding is when you take a piece that is burnt, a hot burning metal, to label the animal. That's not permissible. In certain areas, especially the face. Even striking the face of the animal is not permissible. Right? If you're going to hit the animal to make it move, you hit it on the sides, not on the face, not in any sensitive areas that are going to affect the animal. Right? It is not permissible to overload the animal beyond its capacity. Right? It's not permissible to starve the animal and not give it its nourishment. And there's many examples from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ pertaining to this. Right? One day the Prophet ﷺ came across a camel that was, it was moaning. So the Prophet ﷺ came to the animal and it was grunting, and he began to wipe over the camel. And then after some time he looked around and he said, "Who does this camel belong to?" Then a young boy said, "Ya Rasulullah, it's our camel, it belongs to us." And the Prophet said that the camel is complaining that it is overworked and underfed. It's overworked and it's carrying too much and it's not being fed properly. And there's many other examples like this with regards to the importance of taking care of animals. So even when it's being slaughtered for a maslahah and that benefit is for the people, then to do so properly. Don't use a blunt knife, right? Make sure it's sharp so it can be quick and easy, right? And that's part of the huquq with regards to the animals, right? So if Islam gives this importance pertaining to taking care of the animals and not going overboard in mistreating animals, then isn't it min babi awla, from in the first place, should we not take into consideration how we deal with human beings? In a crazy time in the world we're living in now, where human beings are being dealt with worse than animals. Animal rights are being fought for and people are complaining, we need more rights for our animals. But then the blood of a child and the blood of a human being spilled is, it's next day's news. It's no big deal. People become desensitized to it. We can hear numbers, 40,000, 50,000, 60,000 people being killed, being massacred, being bombed, and nobody flinches. But you hear, oh man, there was a dog that, that drowned, that ran away from its owner and drowned in the canal, and that's headline news. We see it on Twitter, we see it on CTV News that night. Poor dog passed away. We're living in confusing times, right? So in Islam, you see this ta'zeem of, and this glorifying of, taking into the importance of the sanctity of human life. Okay, let's get back to the hadith. The hadith is speaking about Islam, and this is the qa'idah is within that first line. Inna Allah kataba al-ihsana ala kulli shay. Allah has prescribed perfection in everything, meaning that whatever it is that we are to do, we are supposed to aim for ihsan to the best of our ability. We're not perfect, but we got to aim to the best of our ability for perfection. So number one, when it comes to our ibadah and our worship, we got to aim for ihsan, right? We got to try our best to do everything with regards to our worship to the best of our capacity, right? And that's why the Prophet ﷺ, he said in the hadith, Saddidu wa qaribu wa abshiru. Saddid means aim for the target. Try to do everything at its best, in its best way. Aim for perfection. If you can't aim, if you're not going to hit the target, then at least you're going to be close to the target. Qaribu, be close to it. Wa abshiru, and then have glad tidings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Allah will accept what you have done. Right? But it is not from Islam to be lackadaisical about, what we do. Or to have this mindset where we are, we're just mashi hal with everything. It's okay. As long as I get it done. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be the best. As long as I get it done. We should aim for perfection in our ibadah. We should also aim for our perfection in whatever we do. In our jobs, in our interactions, in our business, in our transactions. Whatever it is that we do, we should aim to do our best to aim for perfection. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves when His slave does something that they aim for perfection. In Allah ta'ala, يُحِبُّ إِذَا عَمِلَ الْعَبْدُ عَمَلًا أَن يُتْقِنَهُ. Allah loves when they do it with itqan and when they do it with perfection. So this is the primary principle in this hadith, that we try to do everything to the best of our ability with perfection. Also when it comes to our interactions with people, how we are with our parents, how we are with our wives, how we are with our husbands, with our children, with our neighbors, right? With our community members. Our interactions have to be one where we try to aim to be good with people, right? To the best of our ability, to try to perfect how we are with each other. Okay? So that is the primary principle in this hadith, hadith number 17. Inshallah ta'ala, hadith number 18 is another very short hadith, but an important hadith, but we will leave it for next class, inshallah ta'ala, because there's a lot to mention in the hadith. We'll stop here, inshallah, for tonight, and we'll be back next Wednesday for our next class. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept it from us and forgive us for our shortcomings and our sins. هذا والله تعالى أعلى وأعلم. صلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. وجزاكم الله خيرا.